reason I wanted to start with that one, because it's got the open page on the book to this. This is the first one actually that I attempted while looking at it. References colorations, color patterning. So when I was trying to articulate this representation of the birds through the marine process, this is the image I decided to be as literal with this one as I could be without losing my mind as far as patterning and stuff. But this thrush was the starting point where I wanted to kind of articulate this pattern, work on the counter shading that happens with the dark colors on the top and the lighter colors on the bottom. It's kind of interested in trying to get this speckle pattern developed in the belly. So I use that as my reference point for that piece, which was that bird. Then we jump up to image 4976, which is picking the sheets out of the kiln. So those are stacks of probably 2 inches wide, 5.5 inch long stacks of sheet bullseye that are, some of them are very simple. It's just alternating colors, gray or white, gray or white, gray or white, gray or white. Some of them I took a 1/4 inch section out of the middle and I add another 1/4 inch section and alternate and vary. And they were pretty, there wasn't a lot drawn out for these. I looked at a section of the bird that I wanted to recreate simply, and then in my mind decided how I would need to make a stack that was going to work for this. And then a lot of things started happening that I wasn't aware of when I did these stacks. You can see a few of them in the middle of that kiln. It's got like 3 brown dashes, and it was really interesting that I found with those things, if they had 3 dashes, if I oriented the dashes the same way and made a color field out of those, it looked a certain way. If I flipped every other one, it created a totally different pattern. And if I did a random thing, you would have groupings and patternings happening. So there was a lot more pattern complications that could happen that I wasn't aware of. I was just looking for something with some random dots, and I thought it would just kind of read as a white and beige field with random brown dots, but it all of a sudden became, because everything's so pixelated and dependent on this bit mapping, repetition and variations of the repetitions were possible that I wasn't really kind of counting on when I first started doing this. Next image is just picking up the Marini's out of the kiln. I just soft tack them. I don't do a hard fuse on them, so they're stuck together, but they're barely fused. And then they're heated up and squeezed, and hopefully most of the air is pushed out of them towards the ends when I flatten them, and then they're pulled. Image 508 got the bags of the little Marinis that they're all cut up and set down. And that's pretty much how I do it, although when I'm doing it now, I don't pull one pull per section. I generally am doing 3 or 4 pulls just because it's easier to stack up. It's much faster if I'm going to do a pull, and then I'm not dependent on that pull working to the right thickness I want, because most of the Marinis I'm pulling I pull in a range of a 1/4 inch thick to 3/4 inch thick. Some of them are 1/2 inch. So most of the Marinis are less than a centimeter. When I was first starting to do this, I tried to make them all exactly the same diameter because I thought it would be needed for laying out the patterns. Everything was going to be on a grid system. Then I found I can fairly easily work around different thickness Marinis and work in areas where they go from the thinner Marinis and group down to thicker Marinis and then revert back to thinner Marinis. And that changes because what's happening is you're taking a stack of 15 sheets of 3 mil stacks of colored bullseye. And if you pull that down to a centimeter thick, it's going to have a certain color density. You pull that down to a 1/2 centimeter thick, that color density is going to change. If you're stacking black and white, and you pull that down, if you keep it fairly thick, it's going to be alternating layers of black and white. You pull it down far enough, and it becomes a gray. Your eyes just blend the 2 colors. It's another thing that I learned as I was doing it. You diminish it to a point where it becomes a color tone and not a linear pattern. And these first ones, I really wanted each Marine to contain this linear pattern. A lot of the whites on these is a French vanilla and an opal white, and the French vanilla kind of strikes, so it becomes like an off-white, and you get this nice layering that kind of happens, and then as the bird's pulled and the things are distorted, they lay down, and you get this very subtle feather look that I was going for on those. In pattern 5078, there's these ziggurat step-downs in the brown pattern. I wasn't sure how much was going to bleed out and distort as I rolled it up and sculpted it. And I was also kind of guessing at the layout as far as getting the belly pattern to end up on the belly and the tail pattern to end up on the tail. I made enough birds that I was familiar with the form, and all of my birds start as a bubble. So I worked backwards. I kind of imagined the bubble as it was all colored ahead of time, with the shoulder color being where it needed to be and the chest color being where it needed to be. And then I unrolled that in my mind and tried to figure out how it would be. I actually took some paper and drew up cylinders and worked on, rolling it up, looking at it, seeing where color lines started and stopped, and then unrolled it and seeing what kind of 2-dimensional pattern it made. But then it became just, well, I'll go and try this, and give it a shot. It came much closer. The ziggurat crispness of that shoulder neck thing stayed there, and it really bothered me in the finished pieces. I've worked on a couple ways of taking Marinis and just slicing them out at an angle and then filling that in so you get a nicer, smoother transition as opposed to this really harsh square pixelation that's happening there. I'm taking some and I'll cut them in half, and I'll take them to a little 1/2 inch diamond burr, I'll grind them so they're radiused, and then I'll take another Marini I'll radius the brown Marini, and then I'll take the white Marini and I'll put a curve on it that matches, and then when you fuse them together, they disappear. And then all the negative gaps that are in between these Marinis actually end up, I thought they would create air bubbles if I left too much of a gap, but they pull together, they puddle and the bubbles come up. And you can use that to your advantage. My first ones I really try to pack really tightly, and you get a much crisper image. Plus the image that's on the face of the kiln, the linear quality is much crisper than the open side where they move to fill the air voids and stuff. But they fill unevenly. They suck and pucker and pull, but it's predictable too. So if you leave the same size joints everywhere between a brown and a white and a brown and a white Marini, that negative space will pull predictably. If there's a corner missing, it pulls evenly from all those things. You can get little swirls and things that happen. That it's just another layer of losing your mind. 5087 is the Marini stacked on top of a sheet ready to go in the kiln. The first couple I did, I laid a sheet down and put all the Marinis on top of the sheet glass in order to be able to transport it. And also I wanted to make it thicker, and I didn't want to. There was no sense making it a half-inch thick and pure Marini when I could get my Marini to go twice as far by cutting it thinner and just stacking it on sheets. Then I decided, though, I like the kiln face side better, so now I'll stack them up on a piece of thick paper, and like a magician pulling out the tablecloth and leaving dishes. I try to do that, put a straight edge down and yank the paper out on top of the kiln shelf and try to keep everything there as much as possible. 5102 is it all pre-fused and ready to be cold work. 5104 is the same thing. This is after it came out of the kiln. The image you're looking at, this is the open face side of the image, so it's a little more blurred than the underside. And then before they're rolled up, the edges should be beveled. So that we preheat the tablets overnight, get them up to 1150 is what we're picking them up out of the kiln. I'll have enough tablets to do 3 if we have the time to do it, but I like insurance in there because you never know what's going to happen. So along with the birds in there, I also have some pre-fused smaller tablets that are for the tails. I found that when you close down the cylinder, you get this kind of swirling of color that happens, and it always seems to end up on the top of the tail, and that was distracting for me. So I don't like that little hippie swirl going on there in a very visual spot. If it was on the underside of the tail, it would be fine, but it always ends up on the top of the tail. I started making little fusings that are maybe 3 or 4 inches square that match the coloration on the bird's back for the tail. So that's in there as well. It's a little pre-fused tablet that gets laid onto the tail later on. So the tablets are picked up. I have the rolling yoke that attaches, my pastorelli attaches to my rolling yoke, so we don't have to pick it up once it's set on the pastorelli. It's permanently there. Okay, so shot 18 is picking up and putting it on pastorelli. 22.2, starting the roll-up. 29.2 shows you that the roll-up was way too cold when I went to roll it up, but we managed to bend it around. And photo editing lets you see, because normally shot 31.2 would be closer to a cylinder than it is there. It just was a little on the cold side. First one of the day kind of thing. We wipe the tablets down, get whatever kiln stuff might end up on top of them before we fuse them, and then you get an assistant with a big afro. 41.2, I'm just trying to get the seam to line up so I don't get the shift. It's kind of important that shoulder line match where it meets the back on both sides. It looks awkward. And you also try not to get any stretching from happening when you do the roll-up. Image 25 shows my sculpting marver, which is underused by most people. It's actually a marver we warped really severely, and I'm too cheap to buy a new one. Really nice for sculpting. Image 52.2 is using the paper to kind of close it down. Image 30, diamond shearing it off, getting rid of that little extra that's on the bottom. 33.3, 51, I'm starting to just build up some heat. At this point, you really have to pay attention to the black or the darker areas, like the gray area, where you can see in image 33, it's glowing a little bit more. It's like any other glass. The Bullseye is a lot stiffer of a glass, but as you work it seems to retain the heat longer than a lot of the other glasses do. So even though it's a stiffer glass, if you get it hot as you're building up on your heats, it starts to hold and retain the heat longer, and it's especially true of the darker colors. It's not shown in these images, but I do counter that a lot with using the bench torch to preheat the neck area where I'm necking at 51 like that. That wasn't just done in the glory hole. A lot of that was preheated with the torch to counteract just the glory hole overheat in that gray area. The other thing that I found interesting, I taught a roll-up class at Bullseye during their conference, and all the students were kiln workers, fusers, and they weren't blowers at all. And colors that I at this point had a very limited, and I still do, have a fairly limited very limited color experience with the Bullseye glass. But colors that I was referring to as being very soft, they were arguing that they were stiff colors. So there's this inversion thing that happens. At kiln temperatures, some of these colors appear stiffer than others. But if you take that same color and bring it up to a blowing sculpting temperature, they counter each other and they become softer. So colors that are normally stiff under kiln instances that you want to pay attention to your design because this color is going to be stiffer, it's not going to move as much as that color. It may be the complete opposite when you're blowing it because once it's above certain temperatures, it does different things. So there were colors, like we spent the first few days of that class, we finally brought one of the heads of Bullseye in to kind of talk to us about the color thing, and he had explained that to us. Because there was colors I was adamant with, when we laid out their patterns, we're like, okay, this color's softer, it's going to, these may all be 1-inch strips of glass right now, but the softer color is going to end up becoming wider. So when you finish the blown piece, it's going to be 1.25 inches, 1.5 wide strip, as opposed to being perfectly even. Some that you got to consider in your designing of the tablet is how it's going to stretch out when you blow it. We went back and forth over which colors were stiffer and which ones were softer. So there is that difference between what you know and it'll do in the kiln and what it actually does when you pick it up and blow it and take it further extremes temperature-wise. So I thought it was a pretty interesting thing. I hadn't anticipated that. This image 62, starting to take that form and sculpt it into the bird, laying out where the mass will become the wings and where the mass will become the belly. And all this is pretty similar to the way I do it with a spruce pine batch or any of the other glasses I might be using, more traditional blowing glasses. This cylinder was laid out with steps 62-2 in mind, where I wanted that cylinder to end up looking like this so that I could sculpt it and make a bird. Once I knew I got this form, 62-2, close, I knew, like in the next image, 70, that I would have the mass I needed for the wings, and I would know where to divide it because that's where the colors ended. Normally it's a bit more arbitrary, but from sculpting the birds in the past, I knew this is a shape that I would end up making in the process of making the bird. So my goal was to color this properly as opposed to coloring the finished bird properly. When I first started laying out the wing patterns, when you look at the tablet, there's that white strip that runs around the bottom. And my initial impression was the area just above that was the tips of the wings. And that's kind of what your eye sees. But truly, that, like if you look at image 70, where the gray meets the white, the halfway point, so half the mass that's given to the wing area on the back area in the tablet form ends up on the underside of the wings, you never even see it. So the ends of the wings in my tablets, like if you go back and look at a finished tablet piece that's laying there, the tips of the wings are actually in the middle of that dark mass, and all that other color just ends up on the underside of the wing. So image 66-2, you're squeezing the air out of the wings so that by the time I get down to 76-2, that's a solid mass of gray on top of a hollow bubble. So all the air has been squeezed out of the wing. Then I'm starting to pull the tail mass and set the tail mass up. Image 82-2 is getting the mass set up. So now you get down to image 77, and there's a solid tail mass, a solid wing mass, and a hollow body. And we're laying the tablet, the tail patch on top, which is a small tablet, white on the underside and marini on top, that's going to cover up the little spiral, the little hippie swirl that happens on top of the tail. And then after that's done, everything's pretty cold because I wanted a fairly stable mass, and it's several reheats there in 89 just to build that heat up into the wings where I can get that hot enough to start sculpting. At 95, we're starting to put the cuts into the wing. It's all done with shears and a lot of flipping. 101's getting the lines cut into the tail. When I work the wings and the tail simultaneously, I don't finish the wings and then finish the tail. I'm working them semi-simultaneously. Image 101, the wings are flattened. I'm starting to flatten the tail, and nothing's pulled quite to length. Image 111-2, starting to get the length on the wings. And I have to pull things colder. If I just get it hot in the glory hole and start yanking on things, you get all the kinds of tool marks and dents happening. So I tend to try to build up a core heat and then let the outside chill up a bit so that I'm pulling when it's on the colder side. I get the length I need, but you don't leave a lot of tool marks from the grabbing. You also get carpal tunnel and tennis elbow from pulling it cold, but small price. Image 115-2, putting some of the final heats into the wings to get them to lay down to the body, because this whole time I've been pulling them kind of out and away from the body just so you can get enough heat in it in the glory hole that things don't flop around so much that they stick the piece. And most of the heating of a form like this is done counter to the way traditional blowing of a cylinder would be done, where you're constantly rotating. This is more of a flipping thing, and it's more of a flipping on edge where the bird is going in on its left side and then I flip it over to its right side and then back to its left side. There's not a lot of time spent upside down where it flaps. I mean, if you think of like holding out a piece of paper, if you hold it on edge, you can stand upright because it's got a thicker cross-section. But if you hold it out flat, it's going to want to fold on you. And the hot glass does the same thing. So as soon as it gets hot, it loses all integrity. So I tend to, if you rotate these too much like you would a cylinder, things start to flare out and it starts to distort. The asymmetrical shape starts to pull on it unevenly. It's reminding yourself not to keep it turning too much. Punning 1422, it's a chunk of bullseye glass that we pick up, either cullet or stacked sheet. Pre-make the punnies and throw them in a garage so they're ready to go when we need to punny them up. We're not waiting too long. The collar can be any glass. If I have the furnace running, we use spruce pine to make the collar. Otherwise, same thing, we pick up chunks of bullseye sheet. Image 1452, broken off the blowpipe and starting to close down the head. 115, putting some final shapes on it before I close it down entirely and give it a little bit of a full gesture. I found that if I set the form up a little bit more before I squeeze it down, it looks less like a balloon animal. Kind of put some imaginary planes in there, some implied skeletal structure. Image 119, same thing, setting up some planes just to keep it from looking like an inflated balloon. Image 120, I'm setting up a notch to receive the beak. It keeps the beak from looking like it's just sitting on the surface, so I make a recess that the beak sits into. Image 130, I'm adding the beak bit, which is a few stacks of the bullseye glass they're pre-tacked, and then they're picked up on a punny and melted into the little bit. Image 1542 is the messy state of affairs. My bench usually is. Tool you need is on the bottom. That's all you have to remember. A lot of bench torching. 134 is, that tail has never gotten warm enough in the glory hole to keep it from cracking, so we follow it up a lot with the bench torch every time out while I'm sculpting on whatever we just got hot to sculpt. The assistant's keeping that tail hot. If I get it warm enough in the glory hole, like I said, that bullseye starts to absorb that heat and really retain it, and the bellies start to soften. You can get some distortion happen if you're not really careful. We just run the bench torch off a lot. 136, pulling the beak out. At this point, the beak's the only thing soft enough to move. I do a lot of pulling, and then for scale, but I don't finish the beak until the very end. I do that with all my fine details. I get them generalized, but knowing that all the extremities are going to be the first things to melt down as we're sculpting everything else, I tend to leave the fine details just to the very end. 1572, I'm using the piece of bullseye cane I pulled to lay the foundation for the eye. The eye's done in two parts, the underlying white eyelid and then the black pupil. Image 172 is just putting the final touch to it. I found that if I want some gesture to the bird, I'll, generally speaking, I put the gesture and the attitude in the tail and the wings that are going to be there. But from the shoulder forward, I found it's much easier to put a beak and eyes on a straight-looking bird. Then we use a hot torch to get the neck really hot, and use a paddle or tweezers to push on the beak and give the neck some attitude and its look there, as opposed to putting the gesture in the neck and then adding the beak and stuff like that. It's very difficult to get things to line up straight for me. 166 is just the final heat before knocking off, putting it away. Yeah, we can talk about those pairs. I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do with these birds when I was making them. I knew the assignment I kind of had given myself as far as working on this process and what I was trying to achieve with it visually. But all my previous work had a heavy narrative, and I knew there was so much labor and process going into these that I didn't want to use them in my box pieces where they just became a very small portion of a larger whole. It was just too much energy put in this singular object, and if I was just looking for a colored bird to carry on a metaphor that was part of a greater whole, like a character in a stage, like those other pieces were, it was just way too convoluted of a way to add surface embellishment. I can go into the hot shop in 2 hours using powders to make a convincing looking bird that will give the same narrative. So I realized that this layering, stacking, this bit mapping and pixelating was very important to the process. The process was important to the finished idea. And I like the idea that as I'm stacking these sheets of glass, it's almost like sketching, where when you start a drawing, first marks that you sketch on the paper are visible or still in the final drawing. And that's with all these Marinis, every single line and every stack I make, no matter how small I diminish it and how I combine it with the other ones, every line is still there from the first sheet that I cut. And I started thinking about this, playing with ideas of beauty being skin deep and how we color ourselves and masks and camouflage and reasons for making ourselves ornate. I like this kind of another brick in the wall building block. We are our experiences. We are this buildup of each little square of Marini. So this whole idea of the process was very important to the bird. And the first ones I showed were just the bird on a metal branch perch. I was trying to display the birds, but not have the display take on any narrative that fed the idea. I just wanted it to be about the bird. All that process, the stacking, the build-up, this historical information of the process was lost on people. It was just, it's a nicely made bird, but it was this craziness that I was going through to get to that point wasn't being conveyed successfully in my mind. So I wanted to, instead of sitting there with 56 slide images to show them just the sculpting process, never mind the Marini process and the looking at this whole idea of deconstruction of a three-dimensional existing being, breaking it down into a two-dimensional pattern that had all the color information that was inherent in the three-dimensional thing, and then being able to take it and reverse that, take it back into a three-dimensional object. That whole process was intriguing to me. And I was drawn to the two-dimensional patterns as they existed on themselves. Not being an abstract artist, working very representationally, but then using that as metaphors or using it abstractly with other objects to make my own kind of symbolism or surrealism. I like the idea of the tablets by themselves as being their abstractions. They are what abstraction is. It never dawned on me that abstraction is taking something that was representational and abstracting it down into simplistic elements that deconstruct it. I always thought abstraction was something that I wasn't capable of because I always wanted a reference point. I never really considered the fact that pure abstraction does have a reference point, or can have a reference point. So in these pieces, I started using these tablets as kind of dictates the narrative to show you that this is a bird, this is a pair. This could be a male and a female. This could be a couple. This could be its shadow. This could be an unraveling of its skin in this two-dimensional pattern. So these first two, Avian pair 2 and 3, the tablets they're sitting on are pretty identical to the tablets that was used for the bird. So they're sitting on mirror images of themselves. And when I look at them in space, these two are both oriented so that they're on top of the dark area. And generally, when I'm standing around it and I'm looking down on it, I turn it in a way so that the bird silhouette's over the top of that dark shadow area. And his head is kind of above these spots on avian pair number 2 where the head would lay. And your eye keeps making those connections. You can see, you can convince people that the tablets were made first and then the tablets became the birds. I had a very hard time convincing people that that's what truly happened. But when they see these two together, they're able to deconstruct that bird into that tablet. So it kind of explains itself as it does it. Whether it's the deconstructive skin or it's the unrealized partner that this bird is waiting for, or it's the self it wants to be. It's in the beginning stages as far as where the narrative may go with these. And the scale of these tablets is the scale that is required. It wasn't arbitrary as far as, I think this size base looks good. At this point, it's pretty literal as to this is its source. This is where it comes from. It is the buildup of every little line that was necessary to come before it. So, I could take that base, plug the hole, and bevel the edges and roll it into this bird. I do have some sketches for other pieces where these tablets are scale changes. Originally, I thought I could just put the bird on the base and then put the tablet on the wall next to it, and you would get that correlation. But the scale looked off to me. The tablets looked way too small to carry the wall behind the bird. They needed to be upscaled. And I have shown some of the tablets as just tablets. It's just abstract pattern. But to me, the only thing they could ever be is a bird, because that's what they are. It's all that instructive information of the bird.
Nice. Yeah. Nice. Excellent.